put it back in place. So after the walls were rebuilt, he sets the doors in place, and he appoints gatekeepers, musicians, and Levites. And he puts his brother, the same one that brought the bad report about Jerusalem to him, he puts him in charge of Jerusalem, and assigns the commander of the citadel, because they were men of integrity, and they had more fear in God than most people did. And he says, look, here are some rules about what we do with the gate. He says, we don't open the gate until the sun is hot. And while the gatekeepers are still on duty, shut the doors and bar them. And appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some near their own houses. So he's setting up for the common defense of Jerusalem. And the thing about keeping, when to open the gates and when to close them is to restrict who can come and who can go, and kind of direct the trade. The last part of chapter 7 is a list of exiles who returned from Persia back to Jerusalem. It's a long list. We can go through it at some other time and read it, but it's not really germane to the story tonight. It just know that it was 42,360 people ended up coming back. So I don't know how many people are in Orangeburg. Probably not 42,000, I wouldn't think.
I don't know, but
I
it's
would
pretty
think-
spread out.
I would think it would be maybe Orangeburg city
County.
limits, maybe. But
Yeah. So you got the entire population of Orangeburg that comes back and all of a sudden repopulates the city of Jerusalem. So, this is a big to-do that all these exiles have come back.
I always, when you're talking about posting these guards and watches and all that, and I think about that. So you got guys on the gates,
Mm-hmm.
you got gate guards,
Yep.
and then he's got people on the perimeter. That's
Yep.
the guys on the wall.
Yep. Guys on the wall.
And then you got fire watches. That's the people around their houses.
That's right.
We still basically post the same thing.
You know what? There's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? I'm telling
I
you.
know where they got that
And
from.
we're still fighting over walls.
I know when I was in boot camp at Lackland Air Force Base, of course, you'd have the security police that would patrol in their car. You had the guys at the gate that was checking IDs and stuff, and then I know because I drew many a night shift, in the dorms, I guarded the door and fire watch. You had to make that fire watch 24 hours a day.
Yep.
So yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. It sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? In chapter 8, I told you Nehemiah and Ezra were in Jerusalem about the same time. This is kind of recounted from over in Ezra, when we studied that a few weeks back. Ezra finds a copy of the law, and up to this point, after the exile, or during the exile, the law had pretty much just been in people's hearts. They hadn't had a copy of it. Well, Ezra finds a copy of the law, and he reads the law of Moses to the Israelites. Remember, the whole reason that the Israelites went into exile was because they failed to keep the law. They did not do what was required of them by the covenant that they made with God, for God to be their people, for God to be their God and for them to be God's people. So Ezra finds the law, and he brings the law before the assembly, and all who, it says, the assembly was made up of men and women, and all who were able to understand. So he reads it aloud from daybreak until noon. Now we think about the law that God gave Moses, that it comes down from the mountain with 2 tablets, right? They must have had a lot of stuff written on them tablets for him to be out there from sun up until noon. And all the people listen. I mean, this is good stuff. They're like, man, these are pretty good rules to live by. So he stands on a platform built specifically for this occasion, and he's got the priest on either side of him. And he opens a book and he goes through it all. And basically, what he does is he sparks of revival. You know, this is, we still do this today. I mean, it sounds, from time to time, a church will have a revival and you'll bring in some fiery preacher that'll tell us, man, this is what this church should have been doing all along. Here's where we've been falling short. Come on, guys, let's get back together with this. Well, this is exactly what's going on. Ezra sparks a revival and he renews the covenant with the people. The Israelites confess their sin before God, like, look, God, we understand the whole reason that we went into exile is because we did this, and this, and we didn't do this, and this. And so the whole of chapter 9 is nothing but the Israelites confessing their sins, the things that caused them to go into exile. So chapter 8 was Ezra reading the law. Chapter 9 is the Jews' response to that. And chapter 10 is, okay, now what are we going to do about it? And what they do is they renew their covenant. They make that binding agreement before God, which is simply the same agreement that God has made over and over with them. We saw it at Mount Sinai before they made their trek to the Promised Land. We saw Moses in Deuteronomy renewing it because they didn't know what they were supposed to the first time going into the Promised Land. And they had to wander for 40 years, so they renew the covenant before they go into the Promised Land. At a couple of points while they're in the Promised Land, they've renewed the covenant, and now after the exile, we find them renewing that covenant again. And chapter 11 is, is Ezra and Nehemiah's attempt to reform the society. So even though they have just come back from exile, we see the Israelites still are kind of falling short, not doing what they're supposed to. And so they start about reforming these exiles that have come back. So the new residents come back to Jerusalem. The leaders all move back to Jerusalem from exile. And it says that 1 out of every 10 other Israelites moved back to Jerusalem. So most of the Israelites that went away in exile, a lot of them came back. Now, there were some that just didn't, Think about it. 70 years in a strange place. Well, let's think back 70 years. How many generations within our own families have we had in 70 years? I think I can probably count 4. My people, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, but I don't speak it too loudly living in the South, but my people are from the North. My people are from Pennsylvania. My grandparents were born there. My dad was born in Pennsylvania, but at some point my dad moved to Arizona. That's where I was born, and now I'm settled in South Carolina. Now, if somebody says, hey man, your people are from Pennsylvania, when are you going to pack up and head back to Pennsylvania? I'd be like, well, Pennsylvania's not home. I've never lived there before in my life. Well, think about how many generations of these Jews had settled in Babylon, now Persia. They're like, well, we're kind of comfortable. We got a little piece of land. We got a house and a mule and 40 acres, and
A good example of that is military families.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The parents, one or the other, or now both, join the service. They meet, get married, and then transfer somewhere, and most of the time wherever they get out, especially if they retire.
Absolutely.
So the kids has gotten married. They don't have,
Yeah.
wherever they are when they get married, that's usually home.
That's where my youngest one is like that.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. And so the Israelites were no different. They had gone, after a couple of generations, got comfortable where they were at. And the young, able-bodied people to go back and repopulate Jerusalem, most of them are like, we only know about Jerusalem from stories that, that our grandparents told us, it's not really home to us. We're going to hang out here. But there were some that did go back.
Did you personally find any things that came from Pennsylvania to Arizona, like words, hoagie?
Yeah, well, with my grandmother, I did, because she was born and raised there. My dad was 9 when they moved first to Santa Fe and then over to Arizona. So words like mom, for mom or mother, which always when I heard my grandmother say the word mom, it kind of hit my ear a little different, but that's how they spoke up there in Pennsylvania Dutch country. And so there were certain ways of doing things that my grandmother and my grandfather had were a little different than, what the culture was down in southern Arizona. So yeah, there were some, but, they were all foreign to me.
Yeah.
To hear them tell stories of, going to like what's that? Right up there, you go up, I want to say Youngstown, but it's not Youngstown. Huh?
Johnstown?
No, it's Youngstown, Erie. Well, Erie, Pennsylvania, and right north of it is apple country. And, my grandparents used to go up there and, they were like the equivalent of today's migrant workers. So they go up there during the picking season and pick and everything. And then eventually they owned a little piece of farm up there. And, so that to hear stuff like that, it's like you can't really relate to it because now, all I've known is them in Arizona and, retirees living in a trailer park in Phoenix, It's just like to hear the stories of the old country. It meant something to them because they lived it. To me, it's just like, oh, that's kind of
you
cool.
wouldn't feel home going there.
Oh no, I mean, I've been up there before. Never spent too much time up there, but I mean, it's a beautiful place. But
Yeah.
I would stick out like a sore thumb. I'd stick out up there like I stuck out in Charleston when I first moved here from Fairbanks, Alaska. I mean, I come here honestly, from being out west. I'd always had designs. In fact, I actually did a little bit of rodeo when I was in the military. So I come here. I had my my Stetson hat, my cowboy boots, and everything. And people around here looking at me like, "Where's your horse? And where did you just ride in from?" So I stuck out like a sore thumb, and eventually I going to Pennsylvania probably about the same thing. And I'm assuming for the Jews it'd be the same way. If, for those that had never been in Jerusalem to come back, but some of them did. And so we have a list of Israelites that did come back. In chapter 12, there's a census of the priests and the Levites that came back. I mean, we've got to get our religious system up and running again. And so Nehemiah takes a census of them. And then he decides to put them to work. And so they dedicate the wall of Jerusalem, the rebuilt wall. And let's see, and it's a heck of a party. The Levites were sought out from where they lived, and they were brought into Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with music of the cymbals, the harps, and the lyres or lyres. Musicians come from all the region around Jerusalem, and I mean, they just had one heck of a party. He has the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall, assign 2 large choirs to give thanks, and one was to proceed on top of the wall to the right towards the dung gate, and one was to go to the left. Let's see. Half the leaders with them. Let's see, doesn't say. But anyway, so the 2 choirs are on top of the wall, and they go opposite of each other all the way around, just singing, praising God, and just having a great time dedicating this wall. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much, that's all there is. So chapter 13, which is the last chapter of the book, focuses on Nehemiah's final reform. So this is kind of the end of his work here. First thing he does is he has the book of Moses read aloud in the hearing of the people. And when he reads the book of Moses, and I'm not sure what they're calling the book of Moses, that was probably what we now know as the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you remember from our journey through that story, that there were certain people that were not supposed to be in Israel. The Ammonites, the Moabites, they're not supposed to be in the assembly of God ever. Ever. I mean, God was pretty clear about that. It's like, look, those people are evil. We don't want them over here. But guess who's hanging around in Jerusalem? they kind of migrated there when Jerusalem was destroyed during the exile. And he says, all right, these guys got to go. So all the foreigners were kicked out of Israel. And Nehemiah returns, and one of the three stooges names Tobiah. He throws Tobiah out and all of his household goods. Let's see. And well, there's a king, or excuse me, a priest named Eliashib, and he had provided Tobiah a room in the courts, in the temple courts. So one of the three stooges was right there in the temple, and one of the priests had been giving him a place to stay, and out he's got to go. He's got to go. So Nehemiah evicts him, kicks him out, his whole family. The Levites were restored and given their portions back to their own fields and everything. And then he gets a little bit offended, and he rebukes the officials and says, why is the house of God neglected? We're not doing the things we should do with the temple. And so he calls them together and stations at their post. The tithes of grain, wine, olive oil, everything is brought in the way it should be. And he puts a couple of priests in play, a priest, a scribe, and a Levite in charge of the storeroom. Because they're trustworthy, and he puts them in charge of starting to do the things they're supposed to do. So what he decides to do is to reinstitute the worship system and the sacrifice system, all that the way it should be. One of the things that really just got Nehemiah's goat was that people were not observing the Sabbath. Anything went on the well, I almost called it the Lord's Day. Lord's Day is what we now know as Sunday, the day for worship. But Sabbath for the Jews was the seventh day, which was on a Saturday. But anything went. There was a whole list of stuff you weren't supposed to do on a Sabbath. You were just supposed to rest and worship God, but they still had trade going on. He says, look, so here's what's going to happen. Now that we got the walls up and the gates up, we're going to stop this foolishness. We're going to close the gates on the day before the Sabbath, and they're staying closed the entire Sabbath day, and we don't open those gates again until after the Sabbath. So what would happen was the merchants were just used to coming and going as they pleased. Well, all of a sudden they come, even though it's the Sabbath, the gates are closed, now they can't get in. Well, they got to sit outside. And I'm sure that people that were used to just doing things on the Sabbath and having their own way, but the Walmart truck sitting outside, and the UPS guy, he's got my Amazon, come on. And look, you know what you're supposed to be doing on the Sabbath, so they're just going to have to wait outside. Eventually, they'll figure out that those gates are closed on the Sabbath, and they'll either come the day before or the day after. And basically they're warned, look, don't come back here again. It's the Sabbath, don't come back. And one of the last things he does is he has a word of rebuke, because the Israelites were not supposed to intermarry with the people that were in the land. God was pretty clear about that. He's, I want you to be separate, apart from the people. Not that intermarrying is a bad thing, and I hate to have to say this, but there are too many people that have used this, things like this in the Bible to say, oh yeah, that's not what that's about. What this was about is the people that were doing evil and worshiping foreign gods. God didn't want the Israelites kind of mixed in with that. So don't marry the foreign people. But the men had chose to do it anyway. So he rebuked them for marrying against the rules. And this is not the first time we've seen this come up. And I think it came up in Ezra too, didn't it? Didn't Ezra have something to say about that? Yes. The very last part of Ezra in chapter 10, Ezra called out those who were guilty of the intermarriage, and he actually names names in Ezra. Remember that? Yeah. That's how Ezra ends, with him naming names. So Nehemiah is just kind of picking up on the same theme and recounting that. And then finally, he purifies the priests and the Levites. He said, everything is back the way it should be. It's time for you guys to get to work. And so he purifies them. And and assigned them their duties, each to his own task, made provisions for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. And then last thing he says in the book of Nehemiah, he says, remember me with favor, my God. So the book of Nehemiah starts off with him getting a bad report about God's chosen city and about the ruin that it's still in, and the people that went back haven't done what they were supposed to do. And it ends with him giving God the glory and asking God to remember him kindly for going back and doing what God put on his heart to do. A lot going on there. Both Ezra and Nehemiah pretty much tell the same story, just from different viewpoints. It covers roughly the same time period, just two different viewpoints of what's going on. And it really was about getting God's people back on track after a long period of exile. Next week we'll pick up, let's see, am I going to be here next? Yes, I'll be here next week. Next week we'll pick up with the book of Esther. Esther is a wonderful book. It is the second book that we find in the Bible, the first one being Ruth, that is dedicated to God's story from the viewpoint of a woman, and how a woman plays a prominent role in that particular part of the story. And coincidentally, just a fun trivia about Esther is that it was the ancient Jews argued vehemently about whether or not to include it, whether it was holy enough to be considered Jewish scripture. Obviously it was included. It is also the only book in the Bible not to have a single mention of God in it. There is no mention of God. And that was one of the sticking points with the Jewish religious folks, was how can we put a book in our holy scripture that doesn't say, doesn't even mention God by name. So, but you'll see that just because he's not mentioned by name, there's a whole lot of God working behind the scenes in that book. So we'll pick that up next week. How about you guys? You guys got any insights or questions about the book of Nehemiah, or about his goings on?
It's interesting to me the fact that they're having to bring back the core of the religion, if you would call it religion. I mean, it keeps getting thinned out and brought back, broken.
Well, that's happening today, too.
Yeah.
That's one reason that God didn't want those other tribes intermarrying with the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And really, I think back on our parents, because they wanted to know, being from a small community where everybody knew everybody, they wanted to know who you were going out with.
That's right.
And whether you could go out with them because of their name and stuff too.
Yeah. Or their reputation for being a troublemaker.
Right. But in our community, everybody may not be a Baptist, obviously, or a Methodist, but everybody was Protestant.
Right, yeah. We were Christian.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it really wasn't that big a deal, but you can imagine if somebody, if a family had a reputation of just not believing.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
today it's not such a big issue. It's not as big as an issue as it should be, but back in your parents' time, my parents' time, that was a huge issue. If you were a believer, and man, if your son wanted to go out with a girl whose family didn't go to church, you better have a sit down with your son.
Yeah. One of my good friends,
and we didn't enforce it as much as we should have.
One of my good friends growing up we were like middle school. His family had come from Colorado, and his dad was a professor at USC, and his mother meditated in a pyramid. I mean, it was just weird stuff. You know what I mean? It was like, wow, this is alien. It was like,
it probably was.
Some whole different.
And then being from Colorado too.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole different.
I know, I lived there for a year.
That's like California.
I can tell you, it's quite different out there compared to here.
They would meditate, and he knew a lot about Eastern religious stuff. And so this is weird, but
very different.
But I know if you had a daughter, you may not have wanted her.
Yeah, in that circle.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah.
Or having to re-explain stuff.
Absolutely.
But it is interesting that. I think of the Old Testament, I think it's just all in all done. But as you study it or read it, it's falling apart, coming back, falling apart, coming back. It's just
It's a roller coaster
It
ride
is.
throughout the Bible.
But you take it as, well, this is it, but you don't realize the bumps in the road and stuff we still deal with today.
I'm telling you, yeah, there's nothing new under the sun.
Constantly.
That's why we continue to have revival every now and then.
Yeah, and homecoming.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not talking about just revival as a thing on the calendar that we do every year, every 2 years. I'm talking about when the Holy Spirit breaks out in a church and there is,
It does happen.
there is Holy Ghost revival. When that Mississippi squirrel gets loose,
Maybe that's what we need.
Squirrels. Yeah.
somebody bring a Mississippi squirrel. All right. I'll tell you what, great insights. I appreciate it, y'all. Well, we'll gather again to next Sunday night, and we'll go through the story of Esther. Go in peace.
Amen.
Hey folks, remember to click the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be notified when we post new content. And as always, if today's video touched you in some way, please hit the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. We love to hear how our content impacts your walk with Jesus Christ. Until next time, God bless.